Chapter 1: The Dinner. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the mahogany dining table where Nolan Reed carefully cut his steak. Sunday dinners were sacred in the Reed household, a tradition Nolan had insisted upon when they purchased the colonial-style home in Oak Ridge Heights 5 years ago. His wife Vanessa sat across from him, her auburn hair swept into an elegant updo, barely touching her plate as she checked her phone beneath the table. "Mom, can I be excused?" 10-year-old Caleb asked, pushing his broccoli around his plate. "Finish your vegetables first," Nolan said gently. "Remember our deal?" Caleb sighed dramatically. "But Dad, Uncle Frank lets me skip vegetables when I stay at his lake house." Nolan's knife post mid-cut. Frank Donovan wasn't actually Caleb's uncle, just Vanessa's brother's college roommate who had somehow weaseled his way into their family circle over the past 2 years. The frequent mentions of Uncle Frank had increased lately, and something about the man's too-white smile and lingering glances at Vanessa had been gnawing at Nolan's subconscious. "Uncle Frank isn't your parent," Vanessa snapped, her eyes flickering nervously to Nolan. Caleb slouched in his chair. "Well, Dad, Mom says you're weak and Uncle Frank is a real man." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Nolan watched Vanessa's face drain of color, her phone clattering onto her plate. "He wasn't supposed to tell you that," she whispered, eyes wide with horror. 20 years of disciplined emotional control, home through a childhood with an alcoholic father and perfected during his time as a crisis negotiator, allowed Nolan to maintain his composure. He placed his knife and fork gently on the plate, napkin folded beside them. "I see," he said, his voice measured. He turned to Caleb, whose eyes had gone wide with realization that he'd said something momentous. "Son, would you please go to your room for a bit? I'd like to talk with your mother." When Caleb had gone, Nolan stood and walked to the bar cart in the corner, pouring himself 2 fingers of bourbon. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Nolan," Vanessa began. "How long?" he asked quietly, not turning around. "It's not what you think," she stammered. "Frank and I didn't ask what. I asked how long." The ice clinked against his glass as he took a sip. 6 months, she finally admitted. "But it's complicated." Nolan nodded slowly, memories rearranging themselves in his mind. The girls' nights that left her returning home with her hair different than when she'd left. The weekend spa retreats. Frank's sudden interest in family barbecues and pool parties. "I'm going for a drive," he said, placing his glass down. "I need some air." "That's it." Vanessa's voice rose incredulously. "You're just going to leave? This is exactly what I've been talking about. You never fight for anything. You're so passive." Nolan turned to look at her. Really look at her. The woman he met 15 years ago at a charity fundraiser, whose passion for life had drawn him in. The mother of his child. The stranger who now shared his home. "I'm not passive, Vanessa. I'm calculated." He picked up his keys from the side table. "There's a difference." In the garage, Nolan sat in his Audi, hands gripping the steering wheel, allowing himself exactly 5 minutes of raw motion. The betrayal cut deep. But the revelation that his own son had been poisoned against him, that was something else entirely. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, driving exactly 3 blocks before pulling over. He took out his phone and made a call. "Harvey, it's Nolan Reed. Remember that conversation we had at the New Year's party? I'm ready to call in that favor." 2 hours into implementing the first phase of his plan, Nolan's phone began vibrating incessantly. First Vanessa, then Frank, then Vanessa again. 47 missed calls and total as words spread about what he'd said in motion. But by then it was far too late. Chapter 2. The Architect. Nolan Reed's life had been built on precision. As the son of a brilliant but violently unpredictable father, he learned early that survival meant maintaining control of his emotions, his environment, his relationships. His father, Dr. Maxwell Reed, had been a renowned cardiac surgeon whose hands could repair the most delicate human organ by day but would smash furniture and occasionally his wife's face by night when drinking. Young Nolan had developed a system. Observe patterns, identify triggers, create contingencies. By 14, he could read his father's moods with uncanny accuracy, often spiriting his mother away before the storms hit. This ability to assess situations objectively served him well when he later joined the police force as a negotiator, talking down jumpers and hostage-takers with a calm that unnerved even his colleagues. "You've got ice water in your veins, Reed." His former captain had once commented after Nolan talked a man with a bomb vest into surrendering after 9/10 hours. Not ice. Nolan had corrected. Just clarity. This clarity now focused like a laser as Nolan sat in his hotel room, meticulously creating a timeline of Vanessa's betrayal. The Bluetooth earpiece connected to his phone allowed him to listen to the increasingly frantic voicemails without interrupting his work. "Nolan, what have you done? Call me back immediately." Vanessa's voice trembled with panic. "Beep. Reed, this is Frank. Whatever you think you know, you've got it wrong. We need to talk like men." Beep. "Nolan, please. Harvey Blackwell called me. How did you even know about the mortgage? You're going to ruin everything." Each message revealed another thread to pull. Nolan had suspected financial impropriety. Vanessa had always been in charge of their household accounts, but the extent was becoming clear. The lake house that supposedly belonged to Frank, purchased with a second mortgage on their family home that Vanessa had forged Nolan's signature to obtain. The investments she'd been making with their savings? Not existent. A knock at the hotel room door interrupted his thoughts. Nolan checked the people before opening it to a tall woman with Silver Street black hair pulled into a severe bond. Beatrice, he greeted his former police department colleague, now the most respected private investigator in 3 states. "Still keeping that perfect poker face, I see," she replied, stepping inside and placing a thick folder on the desk. "Even though your world's burning down." "The house is burning. I'm not in it," Nolan replied, offering her a drink which she declined with a wave. "I pulled everything you asked for. Bank records, phone logs, hotel receipts." She tapped the folder, "And I put my best surveillance guy on Frank. The photos are explicit." Nolan nodded, not reaching for the folder yet. "And the other matter?" Beatrice's expression softened slightly. "The audio from your house confirms it. They've been coaching Caleb. Nolan, deliberately undermining you. There's a recording of Frank telling him that real men take what they want, and that you're too weak to keep a woman like your mom happy." A muscle ticked in Nolan's jaw, the only outward sign of the rage building within him. Using his son as a psychological weapon, crossed a line he hadn't anticipated. "There's something else," Beatrice continued, pulling out her phone. "Frank Donovan isn't just having an affair with your wife. He's running a long con." She showed Nolan several photos of Frank with different women at various social events. "He targets affluent families through social connections, seduces the wife, and gradually gains access to family assets. He's done it 3 times before, and the other husbands?" Nolan asked. "One suicide, one alcoholic living in a studio apartment. One went to prison for assaulting Frank, which I suspect was part of Frank's plan all along." Nolan nodded slowly, processing this information. "Thank you, Beatrice." After she left, Nolan opened his laptop and logged into an email account he hadn't used in years. The message from Harvey Blackwell, his old college roommate and now a federal prosecutor, contained just the confirmation he needed. "All in motion. Assets frozen as requested. Preliminary forensic accounting confirms your suspicions. Frank Donovan is on 3 watch lists under different aliases. How do you want to play this?" Nolan drafted a brief reply by their own rules. His phone buzzed again, call number 48. This time he answered, "Where are you?" Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "Exactly where I need to be," Nolan replied calmly. "How's Frank handling the news that all his accounts have been frozen?" The silence on the other end confirmed what he already knew. Frank would be blaming Vanessa for the sudden financial crisis. "You don't understand what you've done," she finally said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's not who you think he is, Nolan. He's dangerous." "I know exactly who he is," Nolan replied. "The question is, do you?" He ended the call and turned back to his laptop. In the reflection of the screen, he caught a glimpse of himself. The same controlled expression he'd maintained through the worst crises of his professional life. But now there was something else in his eyes. Something his colleagues had never seen. Chapter 3: The Deception. By morning, Nolan had pieced together the full extent of the deception. It wasn't just an affair. It was an elaborate scheme targeting not only his marriage but the substantial trust fund that would become accessible on his 45th birthday just 3 months away. The trust, established by his maternal grandfather, had been a closely guarded secret, or so he'd thought. Somehow Frank had discovered it. In the hotel bathroom, Nolan splashed cold water on his face and studied his reflection. At 44, he still maintained a physicality from his police days. Broad shoulders, trim waist, the disciplined body of someone who never stopped preparing for worst-case scenarios. Frank, with his designer clothes and carefully cultivated silver fox appearance, had positioned himself as the more attractive option for Vanessa's affections. But Nolan knew the real draw was the prospect of financial windfall. His phone shined with a text from Beatrice, movement at your house. Pack bags. Looks like they're running. Perfect. Nolan dressed in one of the 3 suits he kept in a go bag for emergencies. Habits from his crisis negotiation days that Vanessa had mocked as paranoia. He selected a blue tie that Caleb had given him for Father's Day, the memory strengthening his resolve. When he reached his vehicle, another text awaited. Your son is with your sister as requested. She says he's upset but safe. The final piece falling into place. Nolan had called his sister Patricia the previous night, asking her to invite Caleb for an impromptu cousin sleepover. If Vanessa and Frank were planning to flee, he couldn't risk them taking his son. The drive back to Oak Ridge Heights took 40 minutes. Time Nolan used to prepare for confrontation. As he pulled onto his street, he noted Frank's ostentatious Porsche parked in the driveway beside Vanessa's Mercedes. The curtains were drawn, but movement was visible through the gaps. Rather than pulling in, Nolan parked a few houses down and approached on foot, using the side gate to access the backyard. Through the kitchen window, he could see Vanessa frantically shoving documents into her designer handbag while Frank paced, just stimulating wildly. His face contorted with rage. Nolan slipped his key into the back door and entered silently, catching the tail end of their conversation. Told you to be careful. Now he's frozen everything. What the hell did you tell him? Frank's voice was nothing like the smooth, confident tone he typically used in social settings. Nothing. He just left after what Caleb said. I thought he was being passive like always. Vanessa's mascara had run, leaving black streaks down her cheeks. Well, your passive husband just destroyed 2 years of planning in one night. The trust fund was the whole point, Vanessa, without it. The whole point, Vanessa's voice faltered. What about us? You said we were. Frank laughed harshly. Come on, you're hot for your age, but this was business. You really think I was going to? Going to what? Frank. Nolan asked quietly, stepping into the kitchen. They both whirled around. Vanessa clutching her chest while Frank immediately shifted his stance, squaring his shoulders in attempted dominance. Reed, Frank acknowledged, his voice regaining some of its usual smoothness. We were just discussing a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Nolan replied, casually leaning against the counter. You targeted my family as part of a con. You turned my wife against me. You poisoned my son's perception of his father. Each statement delivered in the same, even tone he'd used when establishing facts in a negotiation. Frank glanced at Vanessa, then back to Nolan, calculating his options. Look, things got complicated. Emotions got involved, but we can work something out here. Like you worked things out with Thomas Wilkins before he killed himself, or Richard Dominguez before he went to prison for assaulting you, or George Patterson before he lost everything. The color drained from Frank's face. You've been busy. I've been calculated, Nolan corrected. There's a difference. Frank's hand moved slightly toward his jacket pocket. A motion Nolan instantly recognized. I wouldn't. Nolan warned softly. The weapon you keep in your right pocket is already missing its firing pin. What? Frank frantically patted his pocket, then glared at Nolan. How did you? Because I know men like you come prepared for confrontation, but not for someone who thinks 10 steps ahead. I removed it last week when you were swimming in my pool showing off for my wife. Vanessa looked between them. Reality finally dawning in her eyes. Frank, what is he talking about? What weapon? What other families? Your boyfriend has a pattern. Vanessa. Nolan explained, never taking his eyes off Frank. He finds wealthy families, seduces the wife. I sell out her from her husband, then positions himself to access family assets before disappearing. I'm just the first one who noticed the pattern before the endgame. Frank's composed facade cracked completely. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Reed. I have connections. With the Castellano syndicate? Yes, I know. That's why the FBI is particularly interested in our little situation. Harvey sends his regards, by the way. At the mention of the crime family and the federal prosecutor, Frank's expression transformed from anger to genuine fear. You call the feds? Not yet. Nolan replied. That depends on you. On me. Frank scoffed. But the nervous glance toward the windows betrayed his growing panic. On whether you walk away now, alone and permanently, or whether I make a call that ensures you spend the next 20 years explaining your various aliases to a federal judge. Frank's eyes darted to Vanessa, calculating one last angle. Vanessa and I love each other. Tell him, Vanessa. But Vanessa had retreated to the corner of the kitchen, arms wrapped around herself, staring at Frank as if seeing him for the first time. You used me, she whispered. You used my son. Don't be dramatic. Frank snapped. You were eager enough to. Enough. Nolan cut in. Here's what happens now, Frank. You leave this house. You leave the state. You never contact my family again. In return, I hold off on making that call to Harvey. And why would I trust you? Frank challenged. Though his bravado was clearly faltering, Nolan smiled faintly. Because despite what you've told my son, I am a man of my word. For a long moment, the kitchen was silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock Nolan had restored the previous summer. Then Frank straightened his jacket, nodded curtly, and walked out without a backward glance at Vanessa. When the front door slammed, Vanessa collapsed into a chair. Nolan eyed. Not now, he interrupted. Caleb will be home in an hour. We need to prepare what we're going to tell him. Tell him. Vanessa looked up, confused. You mean you're not leaving? Devouring you? That depends on what happens next. Nolan finally turned his full attention to his wife. But Frank was right about one thing. This was just the beginning. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. Nolan watched Vanessa process his words. Her manicured nails tapping nervously against the marble countertop. In the 15 years of their marriage, he'd never seen her this undone. Mascara streaked, hair disheveled. The carefully constructed image she presented to the world completely shattered. What happens next? She finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. First, complete honesty. Nolan replied, setting a digital recorder on the kitchen island between them. Everything from the beginning. How it started, what you told Frank about our finances, and most importantly, what you've been telling our son. Vanessa flinched at the mention of Caleb. I never meant to hurt him. Frank said children adapt quickly to new family structures. That it would be easier if Caleb already saw him as a father figure before. Before you left me, Nolan finished, his calm voice blinds the turmoil beneath. Start from the beginning. For the next 45 minutes, Vanessa confessed everything. How she'd met Frank at her brother's birthday party 2 years ago. How the flirtation had evolved into secret meetings. How Frank had gradually extracted information about their finances, particularly the trust fund that would mature on Nolan's birthday. He said you were too controlled, too predictable. Vanessa explained, unable to meet Nolan's gaze. That your emotional distance meant you didn't really love me. That a real man would fight for me, show passion, and the second mortgage. Nolan prompted. Vanessa's shoulders slumped. Frank said it was an investment opportunity. Property at the lake, we could triple our money in a year. I forged your signature because you're always so cautious with money. I thought I'd surprise you when it paid off. And when did you realize it wasn't an investment? I didn't, she admitted. Not until last month when I found women's clothing there that wasn't mine. Frank said it belonged to his sister. She laughed bitterly. I actually believed him. God, I was so stupid. Nolan turned off the recorder. Yes, you were. But stupidity isn't our biggest problem right now. What is? Trust. Caleb's trust in both of us. He checked his watch. Patricia will bring him home soon. We have 2 options. Tell him a comforting lie or an age-appropriate version of the truth. Vanessa's eyes widened. We can't tell him the truth. He's 10. He deserves better than to be manipulated. Nolan countered. Frank's gone. But the damage he's done to Caleb's perception of me, of masculinity itself, remains. The doorbell interrupted their standoff. Through the front window, Nolan could see his sister's SUV in the driveway. Caleb's small figure fidgeting on the porch. We're not finished. Nolan warned Vanessa before going to answer the door. Caleb entered cautiously, eyes darting between his parents. Is everything okay? Aunt Patricia said there was a family emergency. Nolan knelt to his son's level. There was a situation with Uncle Frank that needed to be handled. He won't be coming around anymore. Because you're mad that I told what Mom said. Caleb's face crumpled with guilt. No. Nolan said firmly. Because Frank wasn't honest with any of us. He pretended to be someone he wasn't. Like a spy. Caleb asked, childish imagination transforming the situation. Something like that. Nolan agreed. But what matters is that it had nothing to do with you. Mom and I both love you very much. As Caleb processed this, Vanessa stepped forward hesitantly. Caleb, sweetie? Some of the things I said about your dad, they weren't true. I was confused and said hurtful things I shouldn't have. Caleb looked between them. Brow furrowed. So Dad isn't weak? Your father, Vanessa said carefully, meeting Nolan's gaze, is the strongest man I know? Just not in the way I thought strength should look. After Caleb went upstairs to unpack, Nolan turned to Vanessa. That was a start. What now, she asked. Now we deal with the financial mess. Nolan pulled out his phone and showed her a banking app. The second mortgage, the drained accounts, the credit cards Frank opened in our names. It all needs to be addressed. I've frozen everything temporarily, but we need to fix this. Vanessa nodded numbly. And us, our marriage. Nolan's expression remained unreadable. That depends on what happens in the next phase. Phase? What are you talking about? Frank's gone, but not dealt with. Nolan explained. Men like him don't just disappear. They regroup and strike back. You think he'll come back? Even after what you said about the FBI. I know he will. Nolan said with certainty. And when he does, we'll be ready. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Nolan drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. The unit had been rented under a name from his past life. Martin Walsh, an identity he'd used during an undercover operation years ago. Inside, he accessed a small safe containing items few people knew existed. Credentials from his police days, a burner phone, and a sealed envelope marked contingency. As he drove back, Nolan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You cost me millions. This isn't over. Frank, right on schedule. Meanwhile, across town in a CD motel, Frank Donovan paced furiously, phone pressed to his ear. I don't care what it takes, he snarled. I want everything on Nolan read. Family, finances, weaknesses, especially the kid. 2 years of work isn't going down because some ex-cop thinks he's smarter than me. The voice on the other and cautioned patience, but Frank was beyond reasoning. No, you listen. Read across the wrong people when he involved the Castellanos. This isn't just about money anymore. It's personal. What Frank didn't know was that the motel room had been chosen specifically for him. The clerk at the front desk, a former colleague of Nolan's, every word being recorded, every threat documented. The board was set, the pieces in motion, and Nolan read, master of the long game, was already 10 moves ahead. Chapter 5, The Counterattack. 3 days after Frank's departure, the first strike came without warning. Nolan was at work. He'd returned to his risk assessment consultancy as if nothing had happened when the school called. Caleb had been collected early by his uncle. The school's secretary apologized profusely. The man had been on their approved pickup list, showed proper ID, and Caleb had seemed happy to see him. Nolan maintained his composure, asked clarifying questions, and ended the call. Then he calmly walked to his office, closed the door, and initiated the protocol he'd established for exactly this scenario. First, he activated the tracking device in Caleb's backpack, a precaution he'd implemented months ago after a school shooting in a neighboring district. The signal showed movement on the interstate heading north. Next, he sent a pre-written text to Beatrice with a single word. Firefly. Within minutes, his phone rang. GPS coordinates received. Beatrice's voice was all business. They're heading toward the lake house. I've got 2 people in the area already. Highway Patrol has been notified of a suspected parental abduction. How do you want to play this? Observe only. No intervention unless Caleb appears in distress. Nolan instructed. I'll handle the recovery personally. Nolan. Beatrice hesitated. You should know that my sources say Frank spent the morning meeting with someone connected to the Castellanos. This could be more than just leverage. I'm counting on it. Nolan replied before hanging up. His next call was to Vanessa, who was at a counseling appointment, part of Nolan's conditions for attempting to salvage their marriage. Frank is Caleb. He informed her without preamble. I need you to come to my office immediately. Bring nothing. Say nothing to anyone. When Vanessa arrived 30 minutes later, her panic was evident in her wild eyes and trembling hands. How could this happen? You said we were safe. I said we were prepared. Nolan corrected, guiding her into his private conference room where surveillance footage from the lake house was already streaming on a large monitor. There's a difference. The footage showed Frank pacing on the dock while Caleb skipped stones across the water, seemingly unaware of the danger. He looks normal, Vanessa whispered, like they're just having a day together. Frank's smart. He knows traumatizing Caleb would eliminate any leverage. Nolan checked his watch. They've been there 40 minutes. He'll make contact soon. As if on cue, Nolan's phone rang with an unknown number. Speaker Vanessa mouth. Nolan nodded and answered. Read. Frank's voice was smooth again, confident. Beautiful day at the lake. Your kid's got quite an arm on him. 5 skips on his last throw. What do you want, Frank? Nolan asked evenly. Straight to business. I respect that. Frank chuckled. Simple really. I want what's mine. The trust fund access, the investment accounts you froze, and a guarantee of no federal involvement. And in return, you get your son back. Unharmed. Happy. None the wiser that there was ever a problem. Nolan watched the monitor as Frank ruffled Caleb's hair affectionately. You've miscalculated, Frank. Taking my son isn't leverage. It's suicide. Big words from a man whose kid is 50 miles away. You have until 6 p.m. to transfer the funds and provide written confirmation that you won't pursue charges. Otherwise, your son and I will take an extended vacation somewhere beyond your reach. The call ended. Vanessa collapsed into a chair, hand over her mouth. Oh God, Nolan. What are we going to do? We have to give him what he wants. No, Nolan said firmly. We're going to give him what he deserves. He walked to a cabinet, entered a code, and removed a small case. Inside was a Glock 19, his service weapon from his police days, and a badge he hadn't worn in years, but had never surrendered. You're going to kill him? Vanessa whispered, horrified. I'm going to end this, Nolan corrected. But first, you need to make a call. To who? To Frank. Tell him you've convinced me to pay, but you want to bring the paperwork personally to ensure Caleb's safety. He'll never believe I betray you again. Vanessa protested. He will, Nolan assured her. Because he believes you're weak, just like he convinced you I was. An hour later, Vanessa was driving toward the lake house, a wire concealed beneath her blouse. Her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. In her purse was a document Nolan had prepared, a transfer authorization that would appear legitimate to Frank's untrained eye. Nolan was positioned in the woods near the property, having arrived via a rarely used service road. Through high-powered binoculars, he watched Frank emerge from the house as Vanessa's car approached, Caleb nowhere in sight. He's locked Caleb in the bedroom. Beatrice's voice came through Nolan's earpiece. Our thermal imaging shows one small heat signature on the second floor, eastern side. Copy that, Nolan murmured. He observed the interaction between Frank and Vanessa. Frank's initial suspicion giving way to arrogance as he inspected the document she'd brought. Vanessa's performance was convincing, a blend of fear and resignation that appealed to Frank's ego. Your husband finally showed some sense. Frank was saying, voice clear through the wire Vanessa wore. Though I'm surprised he sent you alone. He doesn't know I'm here. Vanessa replied, following the script Nolan had prepared. He thinks I'm in my therapist. I just want Caleb safe. I'll do anything. Frank's smile widened. Anything. Now that's interesting. He reached for her then. Exactly as Nolan had predicted. And Vanessa, despite her visible disgust, allowed it. Another piece of the plan falling into place. Now, Nolan whispered into his comm. Instantly, the property was flooded with light as hidden spotlights activated. Frank shoved Vanessa away, reaching for his waistband, but froze at the sound of multiple weapons being cocked. Federal agents. Hands where we can see them. Harvey Blackwell's voice boomed through a megaphone as FBI agents emerged from concealed positions. Frank's face contorted with rage and disbelief. You bitch, he spat at Vanessa. You set me up. No, Frank. Nolan said, stepping into view, badge displayed. We just let you finish setting yourself up. As Frank was handcuffed and read his rights, the charges including kidnapping, extortion, wire fraud, and connections to organized crime. Nolan retrieved Caleb from the bedroom where he'd been watching cartoons, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding outside. Dad, Caleb exclaimed, running into Nolan's arms. Uncle Frank said you sent him to bring me for a surprise, fishing trip, change of plans, buddy. Nolan said gently, we're going home now. Later, as Caleb slept safely in his own bed, Nolan and Vanessa sat in the kitchen where their confrontation had occurred just days earlier. The FBI had been building a case against him for months. Nolan explained. His connection to the Castellanos made him valuable enough that they were willing to expedite things when I reached out to Harvey. You planned all this. Vanessa said, not a question but a realization. From the moment Caleb blurted out what I'd said at dinner, I planned for possibilities, Nolan corrected. Frank's actions determined which plan was implemented. And was I just another piece on your chessboard? Her voice held no accusation, just weary resignation. Nolan considered the question carefully. You made choices, Vanessa. Choices that put her son in danger. That's not something I can easily forgive. I know, she whispered. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to know if there's anything left to save. Before Nolan could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from Harvey. Issue at HQ, Donovan talking deal, claims bigger fish, mentioned your name specifically. Nolan's expression hardened. Frank's counterattack wasn't finished yet. What is it? Records that you, as a former crisis negotiator with considerable experience in criminal psychology, would know exactly how to manipulate, the prosecutor countered. Besides Nolan, Harvey Blackwell shifted uncomfortably. As a personal friend, he'd had to recuse himself from the case, but remained as an observer. This line of questioning seems speculative at best, Rodriguez, he interjected. Special Agent Rodriguez ignored him. Mr. Reed, can you explain why your company conducted risk assessments for 3 businesses now known to be Castellano fronts? Because they presented as legitimate businesses requiring our services, Nolan explained, maintaining his composure. As I've stated in my written testimony, we perform hundreds of assessments annually. Our vetting process checks for obvious red flags, but isn't designed to uncover sophisticated criminal enterprises. The questioning continued for hours, a psychological marathon designed to break Nolan's composure, but composure under pressure was his specialty. When finally released, not charged, but clearly still under suspicion, Nolan found Beatrice waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her sedan. Your wife called me, she explained, said you weren't answering your phone. It's been in a federal evidence bag since this morning. Nolan replied dryly, how bad is it? Bad, Beatrice admitted, handing him a file. Frank's throwing everything at the wall, hoping something sticks. Claims he used Vanessa to set him up because he discovered your connection to the Castellanos. He's convincing enough that they're looking into every client your firm has handled in the past 5 years. Nolan flipped through the file, jaw tightening as he absorbed the implications. He's poisoning my reputation to save himself. Classic Darvo, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, Beatrice commented. But there's something else. Someone's helping him craft this narrative. These allegations are too precisely targeted to be Frank working alone. Someone who knows me, Nolan concluded, mind racing through possibilities. Beatrice nodded. Someone who knows exactly which threads to pull to make the tapestry of your life unravel. When Nolan arrived home, the house was eerily quiet. Vanessa had taken Caleb to her mother's for the weekend. A necessary precaution as the investigation intensified. Without the buffer of his son's presence, the emotional weight of the past weeks hit Nolan with unexpected force. He poured himself a bourbon and sat in his study, surrounded by the artifacts of his carefully constructed life, framed diplomas, family photos, awards from his police days, all now potentially at risk because of Frank's desperate count of moves. His house phone rang. One of the few lines not potentially monitored by the FBI. They're freezing your company assets tomorrow. Harvey's voice was hushed, urgent. Rodriguez convinced a judge there's enough smoke to justify looking for fire. I'm risking my career telling you this, but you deserve a chance to prepare. Thanks. Nolan said simply, understanding the enormous risk his friend was taking. There's more, Harvey continued. They're bringing Vanessa in for questioning separately. They think if they isolate you both, one of you will crack. After hanging up, Nolan stared at the wall of family photos. In everyone, his expression was the same. Control, measured, present, but somehow distant. Had that emotional discipline, so crucial to his professional success, created the void Vanessa had sought to fill with Frank's manufactured passion. The front door opened, interrupting his thoughts. Vanessa entered, alone and visibly exhausted. I thought you were at your mother's until Sunday. Nolan said, not rising from his chair. Mom's watching Caleb. I needed to talk to you. Vanessa replied, dropping her purse on the console table. The FBI called. They want me to come into tomorrow. I know. Of course you do. She said with a bitter laugh. You always know everything before it happens. Always 10 steps ahead. It's like living with a chess computer instead of a husband. The accusation hung in the air between them. Painfully similar to what she told Frank and by extension, their son. Is that why you turned to Frank? Nolan asked quietly. Because I was too predictable, too controlled. Partly, Vanessa admitted, sinking onto the sofa. But mostly because he made me feel seen. You look at problems, situations, contingencies. Frank looked at me even if it was all a lie. Nolan absorbed this, recognizing a truth he'd avoided acknowledging. They're going to offer you immunity, he said finally, if you testify against me. Vanessa's head snapped up. What? That's insane. You had nothing to do with any of this. Frank's crafted a compelling narrative. Your signature on financial documents, my company's connection to Castellano businesses, it creates a picture they can't ignore. But it's all lies. I'll tell them everything. How Frank manipulated me, how you had no idea. And they'll say I manipulated you into believing that. Nolan interrupted. This is what Frank does, Vanessa. He creates no-win scenarios. Tears welled in her eyes. What are we going to do? For the first time in their conversation, Nolan allowed a slight smile. Exactly what Frank doesn't expect. We're going to lose. Lose? What are you talking about? Frank's entire strategy assumes I'll fight to maintain control of the narrative of our future of you. That predictability is what he's counting on. And instead, we let go. Nolan stood, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. Tomorrow, you go in alone. Accept their immunity offer. Tell them everything about Frank, about the accounts, about your suspicions that I might have known more than I let on. Vanessa stared at him in horror. You want me to lie? To betray you? I want you to give them exactly what they expect. Nolan clarified. A desperate wife trying to protect herself and her child. Meanwhile, I'll be implementing the final phase of the contingency plan. What final phase? Nolan, you're scaring me. Good, he said simply. Fear keeps people from asking too many questions. The less you know, the more convincing you'll be tomorrow. That night, Nolan slept in the guest room. Around 3 a.m. he silently packed a small bag, left a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter addressed to Vanessa, and slipped out through the garage. By sunrise, Nolan Reed had vanished. His car found abandoned at the airport. A hastily purchased ticket to Mexico on his credit card. All the hallmarks of a guilty man fleeing justice. Exactly as he'd planned. Chapter 7, The Ghost. Mrs. Reed, when exactly did you begin to suspect your husband's involvement with the Castellano organization? Special Agent Rodriguez leaned forward, recorder between them capturing every word of Vanessa's testimony. I didn't. Not until Frank mentioned something about Nolan's clients. Vanessa stammered. The dark circles under her eyes testament to a sleepless night. Frank said Nolan was using me as a scapegoat if anything went wrong. And you believed him? Not at first. But then Nolan began acting strangely after Caleb's comment at dinner. The way he disappeared, how quickly he froze accounts. How he seemed to know exactly who Frank was and what to do. She twisted her wedding ring anxiously. It made me wonder what else he might have been hiding. Rodriguez nodded sympathetically. Your husband's disappearance certainly suggests consciousness of guilt. Or fear, Vanessa countered. Following the script Nolan had outlined in his letter. Frank has powerful connections. Maybe Nolan felt he had no choice but to run. The questioning continued for hours. Vanessa carefully walking the line between cooperation and doubt. Suggesting possibilities without making direct accusations against Nolan. By afternoon, she had signed an immunity agreement in exchange for her continued cooperation. Meanwhile, in a small apartment 40 miles away, Nolan sat beside Beatrice, watching the FBI surveillance footage of his home through a secured connection. They've been there 6 hours. Beatrice noted as agents combed through the Reed residence. Found the false bottom in your desk drawer yet? Not yet. Nolan replied, checking his watch. Any moment now. On screen, an agent pried open the hidden compartment, extracting a leather-bound journal and several USB drives. Showtime, Nolan murmured. The journal, meticulously crafted over the past year, contained what appeared to be coded entries detailing Nolan's growing suspicions about Frank Donovan's connection to the Castellanos, his discovery of Vanessa's unwitting involvement, and his efforts to gather evidence while appearing to be the clueless, emotionally distant husband Frank believed him to be. They'll spend weeks decoding it, Nolan explained to Beatrice, by which time the information on the drives will have led them to the actual Castellanos money laundered. And that is Lawrence Preston, managing partner at Meridian Investments. Frank's previous best friend before he infiltrated my family. The real architect of the operation Frank was just a frontman for. Beatrice whistled low. Preston, he's on the governor's economic advisory board. How did you? Frank wasn't the first predator to target my family. Nolan interrupted, expression hardening. 3 years ago, Preston approached me about bringing my firm into his investment portfolio. During due diligence, I discovered irregularities but couldn't prove anything conclusive. When Frank suddenly appeared in our lives shortly after I declined Preston's offer, I started connecting dots. So you've been playing a long game within a long game. Beatrice marveled. But why the disappearing act now? Why not just present this evidence directly? Because Preston would have been tipped off the moment I showed my hand. This way, the FBI discovers everything organically, following the trail I've created while believing they're building a case against me. By the time they reach Preston, it will be too late for him to cover his tracks. And Frank is exactly where he needs to be, thinking he's won while actually sealing his own fate. Nolan's phone buzzed with a text from an encrypted number. Harvey confirms they've taken the bait. Preston's being put under surveillance as we speak. Beatrice shook her head in amazement. What about Vanessa and Caleb? How long do they have to believe you've abandoned them? For the first time, Nolan's composed facade cracked slightly. That's the cost of this strategy. Vanessa needs to genuinely believe I might be guilty. Might have fled. Her testimony has to convince the FBI to follow the trail I've left. And Caleb, what about your son? Nolan swallowed hard. He thinks I'm on a business trip. Vanessa agreed to maintain that story until this is over. How long? 3 weeks. Maybe 4. Nolan stood pacing the small room. By then, either Preston and his network will be in custody or I'll have failed and will likely face charges myself. Hell of a gamble, Nolan. Not a gamble. A calculated risk. The weeks that followed tested Nolan's legendary self-control like nothing in his life had before. Living as a ghost in a sparsely furnished safe house, monitoring the investigation through Beatrice's connections, watching surveillance footage of Vanessa trying to maintain normalcy for Caleb's sake. It extracted a toll even he hadn't fully anticipated. But the plan progressed exactly as designed. The FBI followed the trail from Nolan's journal to Preston's operation. Wiretaps captured damning conversations. Financial forensics uncovered the elaborate structure Preston had created, with Frank as just one of several operatives targeting wealthy families to use as unwitting fronts. On day 17 of Nolan's disappearance, Harvey sent the coded message they'd arranged, checkmate imminent. That night, Preston was arrested leaving his country club, the evidence against him overwhelming. By morning, Frank Donovan, realizing he'd been outmaneuvered, was frantically offering a new deal. This time providing details on Preston's entire operation in exchange for leniency. Your name's been cleared, Harvey told Nolan during their secure call. Rodriguez is actually impressed with how you documented everything. Said you'd make a good agent if you weren't such a pain in the ass to interrogate. When can I come home? Nolan asked the question, revealing more vulnerability than he typically allowed. Tomorrow, we'll need you to come in for a formal statement, but it's just procedural at this point. The charges against you have been dropped. After ending the call, Nolan sat alone in the dark apartment, contemplating his imminent return. The threat was eliminated. Frank and Preston would spend years in federal prison. The Castellano connection had been severed. By any objective measure, his plan had succeeded perfectly. Yet something fundamental had shifted during his self-imposed exile. The man who had built his identity on emotional control, on always being steps ahead, had been forced to confront the cost of that approach. A wife who felt unseen, a son vulnerable to manipulation, a life constructed around preparation for worst-case scenarios rather than appreciation of present moments. The question that remained wasn't whether he'd won, but what victory would mean for the family he was returning to. Chapter 8: The Return. Nolan stood on his own doorstep, he in hand, suddenly hesitant. 3 weeks and 4 days had passed since he'd vanished. Necessary time for his plan to unfold, but an eternity in the life of a 10-year-old boy. The door opened before he could insert his key. Vanessa stood in the entryway, her expression a complex mixture of relief, anger, and uncertainty. Harvey called. She said simply, "Said you were coming home today." Nolan nodded. The familiar control that had defined him for so long momentarily abandoned. "Is Caleb here?" "School. He'll be home in an hour." She stepped aside to let him enter. "He thinks you've been away on business." I kept my promise. The house looked the same, yet felt different, subtle changes in furniture arrangement, new photos on the wall, evidence of life continuing in his absence. In the kitchen, a finger-painted masterpiece hung on the refrigerator labeled family in Caleb's distinctive handwriting. The figures were typical childish stick representations, a tall, one labeled dad, a medium, one labeled mom, and a small, one labeled me. All 3 holding hands. "He never stopped believing you'd come back," Vanessa said, following his gaze. "Even when I had my doubts." I'm sorry, Nolan said, the words inadequate but sincere. For disappearing. For putting you in that position with the FBI. For everything these past months. Vanessa leaned against the counter, arms crossed defensively. Agent Rodriguez explained everything after Preston's arrest. How you'd been documenting Frank and Preston's operation for over a year. How you created that elaborate journal and evidence trail. How you sacrificed your reputation, your career, your family's peace to ensure they were caught. It was the only way to end it permanently. Nolan explained Preston was too connected, too protected for a direct approach. So you became the villain, the fugitive, the ghost, her voice cracked slightly. Do you have any idea what that was like for me? To not know if you were a criminal, a victim, or something in between. To lie to our son every day about where you were. Nolan stepped closer, maintaining a contact. I had to make it real, Vanessa. Your testimony had to be convincing. If you'd known the full plan. I could have helped, she interrupted. Instead of being just another piece on your board, the accusation hit. In the silence that followed, Nolan truly saw his wife perhaps for the first time in years. Not as a variable in an equation or a potential security risk, but as a partner who had made mistakes yet still possessed strengths he had consistently underestimated. You're right, he acknowledged finally. I've spent so long calculating risk, predicting threats that I stopped seeing possibilities. Including the possibility that you could be more than a vulnerability in my defense system. Vanessa's posture softened slightly. What happens now? Do we just pick up where we left off? Pretend none of this happened? No, Nolan replied firmly. We start over. If that's what you want. Before she could respond, the front door burst open. Caleb froze in the entryway. Backpack sliding from his shoulder. Eyes widening at the sight of his father. Dad, he whispered as if afraid speaking too loudly might make the apparition disappear. Nolan knelt, opening his arms. Hey buddy, Caleb launched himself forward, colliding with his father with enough force to nearly topple him. You were gone so long. Did you close the super important deal? Mom said it was taking forever because the clients were being difficult. Over Caleb's head, Nolan's eyes met Vanessa. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. This moment, at least, would be shielded from the harsh truths of the past months. The deal's closed, Nolan confirmed, holding his son tightly. And I'm not going anywhere for a very long time. That evening, after Caleb was asleep, Nolan and Vanessa sat on the back porch. The autumn air carrying a chill that mirrored the tentative nature of their reconciliation. Harvey says my company accounts will be unfrozen by the end of the week. Nolan explained. Most clients have stayed loyal once the truth about Preston came out. And Frank, Vanessa asked, the name's still difficult to voice. 20 years, minimum. His cooperation regarding Preston helped, but the kidnapping charge is a loan. Nolan shook his head. He won't be part of our lives again. Vanessa nodded, then asked the question that had been hovering between them all evening. And us, are we, can we? That depends. Nolan replied carefully. On whether you can forgive my methods. On whether I can truly change decades of conditioning. On whether we both want to rebuild rather than just repair. I don't know if we can, Vanessa admitted. But I want to try. These weeks without you, believing you might never come back, clarified a lot of things for me. Including how much of our problems were my creation, not just yours. Nolan reached across the space between them, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Vanessa took it. I've been thinking about something, Frank said. Nolan began cautiously. About me being weak because I don't show passion or fight for what matters. He was wrong about the weakness part, but there was a grain of truth about expression. I've always equated emotional control with strength. And now I recognize it can also be a wall, a way to avoid vulnerability. He squeezed her hand gently. I can't promise to become someone entirely different overnight, but I can promise to start seeing you. Really seeing you. Instead of just calculating around you. Vanessa's eyes glistened in the porch light. And I can promise to talk to you about what I need instead of seeking it elsewhere. To remember that quiet strength is still strength. Inside the house, Caleb called out in his sleep. Not in distress, just the mumbling of a child deep in dreams. Both parents instinctively turned toward the sound. He's the reason we need to get this right, Vanessa whispered. Whatever happens between us, Caleb deserves parents who respect each other, who show him what real strength looks like in all its forms. Nolan nodded, rising from his chair. One day at a time, he suggested, extending his hand to help her up. Starting now, as they walked back into the house together, Nolan felt a tension he'd carried for decades begin to loosen. The calculated man would always be part of him. The planner, the strategist, the one who anticipated threats before they materialized. But perhaps there was room for something else too. Something that had been dormant but never truly absent. The man who could not only protect his family but truly love them as well. Chapter 9, The Recalibration. 6 months after Nolan's return, the Reed family gathered in their backyard for Caleb's 11th birthday party. Children raised across the lawn while parents clustered in conversational groups. The normality of the scene belying the extraordinary journey that had preceded it. Nolan stood at the grill, carefully flipping burgers while maintaining conversation with other fathers. A role he would have previously delegated to Vanessa while he observed from a strategic distance. Now he leaned into the casual camaraderie. His laughter genuine, if still somewhat reserved. From across the yard, Vanessa watched this transformation with quiet appreciation. The changes in their marriage hadn't been dramatic or instantaneous. More like incremental adjustments to a finely calibrated instrument. Nolan still maintained his approach to life, but had learned to soften its edges to make space for spontaneity and emotional expression. He seems different, Patricia commented, joining Vanessa with a glass of lemonade. More present. He is, Vanessa confirmed. We both are. The reconstruction of their marriage had been painstaking work, weekly counseling sessions, difficult conversations about trust and resentment, gradual rebuilding of intimacy. There have been setbacks and arguments, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface. But underlying it all was a shared commitment to something neither had fully appreciated before, the possibility of growth. Nolan had returned to his consulting firm but with a rebalanced approach to work and family. He still maintained security protocols, the tracking app on Caleb's phone, the regular background checks on new associates. But discussed these measures openly with Vanessa rather than implementing them unilaterally. For her part, Vanessa had confronted her own need for external validation, the insecurities that had made her vulnerable to Frank's manipulation. She'd returned to the interior design career she'd abandoned after Caleb's birth, rediscovering a sense of purpose beyond her roles as wife and mother. "Dad, Mom, come quick," Caleb shouted from the patio, interrupting their reflections. "Uncle Harvey's here with the surprise." Nolan handed the grilling tongs to another father and joined Vanessa as they walked toward the house, where Harvey stood beside a large object covered with a tarp. "Right on schedule," Nolan noted with appreciation. "Would you expect anything else?" Harvey replied with a grin, clasping Nolan's hand warmly. Their friendship had not only survived but strengthened through the ordeal. Harvey's unwavering support during the investigation earning Nolan's deepest loyalty. "What is it?" Caleb bounced with anticipation. "Why don't you find out?" Nolan suggested, nodding toward the tarp. With dramatic flair, Caleb pulled away the covering to reveal a telescope, not a toy, but a serious amateur astronomer's model on a sturdy tripod. "Well," Caleb breathed, eyes wide. "Is this really for me?" "For all of us," Nolan corrected, kneeling beside his son. "Remember our talks about the stars? How I used to watch them with my grandfather. Now we can see them up close together." Vanessa felt her throat tighten with emotion. Nolan's grandfather, the source of his trust fund and one of the few positive influences in his turbulent childhood, had been someone he rarely spoke about. That he was now sharing this connection with Caleb represented a profound shift in his willingness to reveal himself. As the party continued, Caleb proudly showed off his telescope to friends while Nolan engaged with parents, many of whom had stood by the Reeds during the investigation and its aftermath. The community had rallied around them once the truth about Preston's operation became public, a response that had surprised Nolan, who had always kept neighbors at a calculated distance. Later, after guests had departed and Caleb had finally been persuaded to leave his telescope for bedtime, Nolan and Vanessa sat in their customary places on the back porch. The evening routine had become a touchstone in their reconstructed relationship, a time for honest conversation without distractions. "Good day," Nolan observed, relaxing into his chair. "The best in a long time," Vanessa agreed. She hesitated, then added, "I got a call from the prosecutor's office yesterday. They wanted to update me on the case." Nolan's posture shifted subtly, alert but not tense. "What did they say?" "Preston's cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony has implicated 3 more Castellano associates." She paused and Frank lost his appeal. "The kidnapping conviction stands." Nolan nodded, absorbing this information. "Are you okay?" Hearing about him again. The question, simple but profound in its consideration of her emotional state, exemplified the changes in their relationship. "I am," she said thoughtfully. "It feels like a previous life. Someone else's story." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The evening air filled with the gentle chorus of crickets and distant traffic. "I've been thinking about what you said when you first came back," Vanessa ventured. "About starting over rather than picking up where we left off." Yes. I think we've done that. Not erased the past, but rebuilt on a different foundation. Nolan considered this a calculated reconstruction. He offered with a hint of self-deprecating humor. Vanessa smiled, recognizing his attempt to acknowledge his nature while also transcending its limitations. With room for variables, she added. For uncertainty, for growth. And for this. Nolan said, reaching for her hand, a gesture that had once been rare but was now comfortably familiar. Inside, Caleb called down from his bedroom window. Dad, Mom, can we set up the telescope tonight? Please, the sky's super clear. They exchanged glances, both remembering a time when Nolan would have insisted on adherence to schedules when bedtime was sacrosanct. What do you think? Vanessa asked, leaving the decision to him. Nolan considered for exactly 3 seconds. A lifetime shorter than his former deliberations. Why not? Some rules are meant to be broken. Caleb whooped with delight, his footsteps thundering down the stairs. As they prepared to explore the night sky together, Nolan explaining the mechanics of the telescope, Vanessa bringing out blankets for the DUI grass, Caleb bubbling with questions about distant galaxies. They formed a tableau quite different from the family that had sat at dinner months ago, when a child's innocent comment had shattered their carefully constructed facade. That night, as Caleb finally drifted to sleep after an evening of stargazing, Nolan paused in his son's doorway. The telescope stood by the window, positioned for morning observation. On the wall hung a new family portrait taken just last week, showing the three of them laughing, their expressions natural and unguarded. He felt Vanessa beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. He looks so peaceful, she whispered. He feels safe again, Nolan observed. We all do. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely offered those. Frank and Preston were incarcerated, but the echoes of their manipulation would occasionally resurface in unexpected moments of doubt or insecurity. The Reed family had been tested, broken apart, and reassembled. Not identical to what they had been, but perhaps stronger in the repaired places. Nolan read, still calculating, still vigilant, but now intentionally present. Stood with his wife, watching their son sleep, allowing himself to fully inhabit the moment rather than anticipating the next threat or planning the next move. I love you. He said simply, words that had once been rationed like precious resources now offered freely. I know. Vanessa replied, leaning into him. Not because you say it, but because you show it. Every day in 1,000 small ways. They closed Caleb's door quietly and walked down the hallway together, toward their shared future. One built not on illusions of perfection or fear of vulnerability, but on the honest recognition of who they were and who they could become. The calculated husband, the resilient wife, the recalibrated family, moving forward together one step at a time.